most of what people are thinking about when they think of hair loss is male pattern baldness, which is the androgenic alopecia. And it is striking to me that there's a good amount of research showing deficiencies of nutrients that can improve this or help with other treatments in tandem. So what nutrients am I talking about? Well, there are good studies suggesting that many minerals, zinc, copper, magnesium, and selenium, and vitamins B12, E, D, and folate have been shown to be deficient in people with androgenic alopecia. And I'll show an article detailing that in a moment. There's also research looking at things like L-carnitine supplementation improving hair regrowth. And where do you find L-carnitine? Maybe I'll keep you in suspense for a moment and then tell you that it's meat. There's the carn, the C-A-R-N, Latin is in there. It's carnal, kind of like carnosine, something I spoke about a few podcasts ago when I was talking about longevity and nutrients that are connected with longevity. And many of those nutrients are found exclusively in meat. In fact, all of the nutrients I was talking about in that podcast were found exclusively in meat. So you can go back to podcasts if you want to hear my arguments for unique nutrients found in meat that have solid evidence for improvements in longevity. I would say looking to invalidate or at least challenge strongly the hypothesis that meat is in any way bad for longevity. And I've done that on multiple podcasts at this point. Along the same vein, there's evidence that taurine, a nutrient that I've been enamored with recently, which has been studied across multiple species and improves longevity in worm models, in mice, and in primates, and still probably needs to be studied in humans. But how do you study longevity in humans? That's pretty difficult, basically impossible unless you're doing a case control or a prospective study. Perhaps you can't actually do an interventional study looking at longevity in humans, so you get why that hasn't been done. But in primate models, taurine supplementation improves longevity. Well, taurine supplementation or deficiencies in taurine are linked with hair loss. I mentioned iron deficiency with women specifically and female pattern hair loss, and also deficiencies of the amino acid L-lysine have been linked with hair loss. So what we find is this pattern of nutrient deficiencies. And then I look at that and I think, where do humans get these nutrients? Where are the most bioavailable forms of these nutrients? Well, as I've spoken about in the past with regard to things like zinc, for instance, which has been studied in great detail and found to be very helpful in preventing or perhaps even reversing hair loss in some cases, especially the androgenic alopecia. What is the best source of zinc that we know of in humans? Well, it's oysters and red meat and animal foods. And so I found it quite ironic that if you look at zinc, and I'll show evidence in a moment corroborating the claims that zinc is super important for hair loss prevention or improvement of hair loss. And so we can go to the ivory tower of all ivory towers and look at Harvard. And I'm showing a video for people that are watching, people that are just listening. You can go to the video if you want to see this. Here's a Harvard article about zinc. Zinc's a trace mineral, et cetera, et cetera. Where do you find zinc? Well, meats, poultry, and seafood are rich in zinc. And I find it incredible and a little bit ironic that Harvard admits this clearly, something I've been saying for a while. Some plant foods like legumes, which is beans and whole grains, are also good sources of zinc, but, and this is a big but, they also contain phytates that can bind to the mineral, lowering its absorption. So when I talk about phytates, which is essentially phytic acid in things like oats, people always criticize me and say this isn't a big deal, but they do, and they have been shown repeatedly to prevent the absorption of zinc and other minerals, all of the divalent cations, and in fact, all of these minerals studied in the studies that I'll show you in a moment, zinc, copper, magnesium, selenium, these are all divalent cations, can be bound by phytic acid found in legumes and whole grains, and their absorption can be prevented. I've shown a study multiple times. I won't show it now, but it's easy to find. It's a study with oysters from, I believe, the 1950s or 1960s, showing that if you give people oysters, you'll see the blood levels of zinc rise and you see hair growth. Well, they didn't study that in the study, but you can imagine that it would help with that. And when you give people that oyster with beans or with a tortilla, that absorption of zinc is significantly lessened. The levels of zinc in the blood are abrogated. In fact, they go to essentially zero if beans and tortillas are given together. It's no sort of cultural affront. It's just these are foods that contain phytic acid, grains, and beans. So where do you get your zinc? You get your zinc from animal foods. You don't get much, if any, bioavailable zinc from plant foods. I remember when I was a raw vegan, and I was a raw vegan for those of you who didn't know that, about 14 or 15 years ago, I remember hearing in the vegan grapevine that pumpkin seeds were a great source of zinc. Well, pumpkin seeds contain a lot of zinc, but is much of that bioavailable? No, because like most seeds and most plant seeds included in this, including beans and nuts and grains, which are all plant seeds, they're all planted in the ground, they grow into plants. They contain phytic acid, a compound that is a large molecule that chelates these minerals and prevents their absorption into your body. So I also incidentally had a pretty significant magnesium deficiency when I was a raw vegan, but I was eating tons of things like kale and almonds, which are supposed to be great sources of magnesium. Little did I know at the time, live and learn. We all make mistakes. We're humbled that magnesium is not very bioavailable in kale. It's not very bioavailable in things like almonds because of oxalates, which can also chelate these minerals, prevent their absorption, and phytic acid in these plant foods. So my assertion in this podcast will be that if you want to have healthy hair, including animal foods in significant portions in your diet is a way to get that. And that's why I thought the anecdotes from people on carnivore, especially coming from vegan diets, were interesting. We can imagine what's happening when somebody is on a whole foods, plant-based, AKA vegan diet. They're not getting these nutrients and they see hair loss, whether this is telogen effluvium or potentially even alopecia areata, or it's worsening androgenic alopecia. We don't know exactly what the diagnosis is, but there are tons and tons of anecdotes of people losing hair on vegan diets. And we can tell why, because the nutrients found predominantly in bioavailable forms in animal foods help with hair regrowth, hair maintenance, hair health, and you don't get that on a vegan diet. So I don't know what to tell you other than, and this actually came up recently. I was on Russell Brand's podcast this week. I will say this, I applaud vegans for making an intentional choice with regard to their health and their food choices. I just fear that is a wrong food choice and that vegans, people who are plant-based, are selecting foods that are deficient in many nutrients. This is something I talked about in the longevity podcast. Taurine, anserine, carnitine, choline, carnosine, B12, K2, et cetera. The list goes on. That's just a partial list. And deficient in bioavailable forms of many of the minerals and vitamins that are essential for proper hair growth, germane to this podcast. So another argument against a vegan diet in my book. So let's look at some of this research. This is a cross-sectional study of plasma trace elements and vitamin content in androgenetic alopecia in men. And I will highlight here that they say it was shown that all patients with androgenetic alopecia, AGA, have a deficiency of elements, zinc, copper, magnesium, selenium, vitamins B12, E, D, and folic acid is what they say in the paper. One of my pet peeves is that researchers continue to misquote this. This is not a deficiency of folic acid. This is a deficiency of folate. Folic acid does not occur in the human organism. Do not make that mistake if you guys are talking about this. All patients had a deficiency of these vitamins and minerals. Well, zinc, found in meat, found in oysters, found in essentially all animal foods. Copper, where do you get copper? This is a key point here, guys. You need to get liver to get copper. There's no copper in muscle meat of any significant amount. There's copper in mushrooms, in some mushrooms, questionable bioavailability, but I think the best source of copper is clearly liver. Magnesium, I've done content on this. Where do you get magnesium? Well, you can get magnesium easily on an animal-based diet, or in animal foods, it's very bioavailable. On an animal-based diet, sources of magnesium would be things like coconut water, orange juice, raw milk. On a strict carnivore diet, you will find that about 1 pound of meat has around 100 milligrams of magnesium that's very bioavailable. So if you're eating a couple of pounds of meat per day, you're getting 200 plus milligrams of magnesium per day, which is a good amount, especially if it's bioavailable. So animal foods are great sources of magnesium. You've been told it's plant foods, but how much of that is bioavailable? Selenium, I think, again, animal foods are clearly the best bioavailable sources. Some may say, but wait, Paul, what about Brazil nuts? And I think that Brazil nuts are not going to be very bioavailable in their selenium because they're a nut. They're going to contain phytic acid and other things that make it problematic. And there are two different types of selenium, selenocysteine and selenomethionine. Selenomethionine is the form found in Brazil nuts, and selenocysteine is the form found in animal foods. And I believe there is a significant amount of evidence to suggest that selenocysteine is superior to selenomethionine. So again, there is this ongoing argument that I would make that animal foods are going to contain more highly bioavailable sources of many of these compounds, essential and important for hair growth and optimal health in general. As we talked about in that article briefly, vitamin B12, well, that's only found in animal foods. Vitamin E, where do you get vitamin E on an animal-based diet? Well, People don't know this, but animal fat is a great source of vitamin E. So butter, raw milk, even tallow, the fat in your steaks, that has vitamin E. And I don't know why the USDA hasn't caught on to this. And I've heard people say this on podcasts. I remember Rhonda Patrick, who I've never been able to convince to have an actual respectful debate, incidentally, though I respect her work greatly, said on Joe Rogan, where do you get vitamin E on a carnivore diet? And you get vitamin E in animal fat. I've done this illustration multiple times. I've checked my levels of vitamin E in my body, in the serum and the plasma, and they are above the reference range. They're high normal when I was on a strict carnivore diet. So there's tons of vitamin E. And why wouldn't there be vitamin E in animal foods? It's fat soluble after all. So don't worry about vitamin E on an animal-based diet. You don't need to be eating things like canola oil or seed oils to get vitamin E. That's ludicrous. Vitamin D, you better get out in the sun. And then folate, I think you can get folate from foliage. You can get it from plant foods. But I think the best sources of folate for humans are probably going to be things like egg yolks and liver. So again, we're back to a clearly animal-centric diet, an animal-based diet, to have the most amount of these good nutrients in your diet. Another article that I think is great, The Role of Vitamins and Minerals in Hair Loss, a review. I mean, this is in a dermatology journal, and yet, as I said, most ivory towers won't tell people, men or women looking at this, that nutrient deficiencies can worsen all types of hair loss. The authors say deficiency of such micronutrients may represent a modifiable risk factor associated with the development, prevention, and treatment of alopecia. Given the role of vitamins and minerals in the hair cycle and the immune defense mechanism, large double-blind placebo-controlled trials are required to determine the effect of specific nutrient supplementation on hair growth in those with both micronutrient deficiency and non-scarring alopecia to establish any association between hair loss and micronutrient deficiency. They go on to say iron, vitamin D, folate, B12, and selenium are vitamins and minerals that may be involved in hair graying or whitening during childhood or early adulthood. Supplementing these deficiencies can improve premature graying. So many of you may know someone with premature graying. And again, these nutrients are found in the most bioavailable forms or exclusively in animal foods. I talked earlier about iron, especially in women, but iron deficiency can lead to premature graying. Vitamin D from the sun, folate, vitamin B12, selenium, selenocysteine versus selenomethionine. Again, we'll circle back to that. One of the things that's interesting to note about hair loss research as I dove down this rabbit hole was that there seems to be a very good model for this in vitro. So often when we're looking at research studies, we're thinking in vivo is better, in the body. And we see in vitro studies in a test tube and we think this isn't really that accurate. But I found multiple studies in dermatology journals suggesting that in vitro research on the hair follicle is actually pretty good and predictive of what happens in the human body. So when I came across studies like this one, L-carnitine promotes hair growth in vitro, I find it to be interesting, and I think that it's probably pretty valid. So where do you find carnitine? In animal foods. The human body makes a little bit of carnitine, but supplementation appears to improve, at least in vitro, could improve hair growth. When was the last time that you or someone you know with male pattern baldness had L-carnitine recommended to them? In fact, when was the last time that someone you know who has male pattern baldness or female pattern baldness had steak recommended to them or liver recommended to them? Well, these are great sources of L-carnitine and all of the nutrients we've talked about so far.